Christmas present before Halo was a giant toy replica of an aircraft carrier, complete with a set of toy replica planes that I would fly around in my fingers, bombing the fucking shit out of vaguely defined enemies. Pilots getting shot down, ejecting, tell my wife I love her, the heroic sacrifice, the good guys always winning in the end, playing out whatever cliches I had picked up from Top Gun or whatever other gymnastic high-octane war movie I was rewatching every day that week. We were the good guys, the strongest guys, and the guys who always won. America. Fuck yeah. But Halo was a game that had you simulate some very different kind of scenarios. I'm older now, so it's easier to maintain a cool detachment from what's going on any screen. But back then, the existential dread of humanity's struggle against the genocidal onslaught of an alien race who they could barely put up a fight against haunted me. Can you imagine what that would be like, I would think to myself, having the whole species wiped out, having the world end, knowing these are end days? The mere simulation of these feelings was so intense, so alarming that it made everything going on in my 8-year-old real world feel trivial. The concept of extraterrestrial invaders was first introduced to us by H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds in 1898. Halo has done a better job than any other fiction to date of capturing the existential horror that Wells originally sought to portray when he first invented the genre. In Wells' view, the superior technology and intellect of the Martian invaders and their subsequent extermination of most of the human race was really not so different from the atrocities Western imperialists had committed against the indigenous populations of the various populations they had colonized. Wells specifically mentioned the Tasmanians, who Britain had conquered and killed the fuck out of, but the analogy is of course apt for any number of the British Empire's ventures into Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Western Hemisphere generally. It is likewise a fine analogy for Cortez in South America, or of course the United States genocide of Native Americans. In a passage of the book's first chapter, he would write, "Before we judge the Martians too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its own inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit?" By depicting Great Britain, the ultimate imperialist power, completely at the mercy of an invading army whose powers it could barely comprehend, much less counter, Wells exposed Western audiences to a feeling they had never known. A century later, Halo accomplished something similar. Such feelings of terror and despair are all too familiar in many other nations' history books around the world, but not ours. Our history books told tales of the plucky underdogs who rebelled against an empire, of the heroes who reluctantly entered world wars that would be finished shortly after, of the shrewd tacticians who outwit yet another menace in the Cold War. At worst, we studied Vietnam not exactly as a loss, but simply as a venture we decided was no longer worth the effort. Did we learn of the native genocide as well? Of course. But we did not identify with the natives, we identified with the American government and felt remorse over what we had done with our immense, unmatched power, and resolved to use that immense, unmatched power more carefully in the future. Watching a fictionalized mankind at a technological peak 500 years in the future get absolutely pwned, its planets glassed, its ships wiped out, even the in-game combat of Marines getting cut down like papier-mâché by active camo plasma sword-wielding ultra-elites, introduced the youth of America to a concept that was markedly and deliberately absent from any media we had consumed until then. The idea that there could be something more powerful than we were. The idea that we could lose. Not only lose, but lose everything. Our world, our way of life, our species. It was fascinating. It was exhilarating. I couldn't put the controller down, and when I did beat the campaign, I binge-read every book because I was afraid of this feeling, but entirely captivated by it. I had to know how it ended. I had to know what the fuck was going on. And what was there in the end? Not a decisive triumph of good over evil, instead all life itself just barely holding on. Not a victory parade with trumpets, but a quiet memorial and a solemn handshake. Humanity owing its survival to the very genocidal maniacs that it had almost been destroyed by, and vice versa. The Human Covenant Alliance had been foreshadowed almost from the beginning, with a significant portion of Halo 1 taking place aboard the Covenant CCS-class battlecruiser Truth and Reconciliation, whose name was a clear reference to the Truth and Reconciliation committees usually set up in the aftermath of civil war or authoritarian regimes to help nations heal through justice and forgiveness. The most notorious of such commissions was set up in South Africa after the cartoonishly racist apartheid system was finally brought down in '95. Some say we need such a commission for black and white here in the States, others say we need it for left versus right. I remember that rush when humans first team up with elites and hunters at the end of Halo 2, just thinking of our enemies like, damn, y'all fucked up now. I think about the vicious civil war that's been waged in this country over the last decade, waged in every way just short of violence. Our battlefields, so many courtrooms, newsrooms, boardrooms, cyberspheres, comment sections. Our parliamentary and legislative systems stressed to their limit, hacking, cheating, stealing, lying, all the clever ways we found to screw one another over, protesting, striking, donating, voting. Each side pushing the other towards mastery of combat through non-violent means. It's the kind of combat that will define the 21st century. I look back on the epic battles we've fought, and I pity the fool who should ever have to face us together. The elite's change of heart was of course precipitated by the realization that their cause, the Covenant itself, was fraudulent. It was Halo's boldest and most consequential message. The elites had fought a vicious war for decades. They had killed billions, lost billions more of their own, and dedicated the entirety of their lives to this single purpose, convinced that it would bring them life after death. How can something be untrue when every single person you know believes it too? When a belief system is so completely internalized by a society that even the wisest, fairest, and most talented individuals don't bother questioning it. Can we imagine what it would feel like to have such a belief system obliterated practically in an instant, to look back on everything you had lost, the atrocities you would commit, and realize it was all for nothing more than a fairy tale with no more legitimacy than the monsters under your bed? Of course we can imagine that, because though it was an alien plotline in Halo, any reader of history knows such a phenomenon is all too human in the real world. The elite's experience was not so different from what Nazi Germany went through in the aftermath of World War II, not so different from the Soviets after the Cold War. To a lesser degree, it's the kind of thing experienced by members fleeing religious cults like Scientology. Here in the States, many of us felt a dose of it after Vietnam or Iraq, the Gulf of Tonkin and WMDs being lies so big that it was unfathomable that they were lies at all, until it wasn't. It is that sinking pit in the American stomach when we reflect on how much of our present-day comfort and wealth is not owed to our being heroes, but is owed to the exceptionally profitable genocide and slavery we practiced in our earliest years. That pit in the stomach which would lead even Thomas Jefferson, the slave rapist, to darkly warn that he trembles for his country because God is just and his justice cannot sleep forever. Do such fears also haunt the English and the Spanish and every other colonial empire that waged a centuries-long war against technologically inferior races with different languages, different cultures, different skin colors, only to in the end be faced with the brutal realities of empathy and equality, and to thus have no choice but to confront their own profound sin? And what would God's justice look like? Perhaps a disease that spread throughout all the land, consuming and destroying everything it could. A merciless enemy that could not be reasoned or bargained with. COVID? No. I speak of the Flood. The Flood were Halo's most brutal plot twist. In the span of a single level, the player is made to realize this isn't a game about saving humans from aliens. This is a game about saving life itself from space zombies. Creepy, crawly, squirmy little hive mind spore spawn that impregnate the walls and any host they can find with their slimy green seed. The player's introduction to the Flood was a masterclass in horror and suspense. Marines who had lost their marbles, grainy footage of catastrophe, the dread of seeing Captain Key's face consumed in the belly of some hellspawn zombie potato, and imagining the terror of what he went through, mowing down creatures that are still so reminiscent of the Marines you had come to love and would revert to checkpoints over and over and over again just to save a few levels before, having to turn on your own for the sake of necessity of seeing humans robbed of every last shred of their humanity, living in fear of things that on their surface look so much like you, and knowing that should they catch you, a fate worse than death awaits. These kinds of experiences are a part of every zombie story, and they are what make the zombie genre so fascinating. Indeed, it's clear that man's obsession with the concept of zombies, measured in movies, books, television, whatever other media, is unmatched by our interest in things like vampires, werewolves, mutants, cyborgs, or any other number of threatening creatures in the sci-fi fantasy universe. What is it about zombies that we find so uniquely compelling? Many may be tempted to draw a parallel to man's understandable fixation on real-world diseases, which have played such a significant role in our species' history, like the bubonic plague, the Spanish flu, or COVID. But I think this misses the mark, because there are much worse things than disease out there, and they're much more contagious. A growing body of research has found that things like narcissism, trauma, and loneliness are just as transmissible as any bacteria or virus. That the more time we spend around someone afflicted by these conditions, the more likely we are to develop such conditions ourselves. I believe our collective fascination with zombies is in fact a subconscious reflection of this, because these kinds of mental afflictions align more with our characterization of zombies than traditional physical illnesses do, for a few reasons. First being the active role the infected play in spreading their infection. A chronically lonely person, feeling generally rejected by their peers and fearing the pain of further rejection, will then themselves reject any overtures from friends or family who do reach out. This rejection will in turn hurt said friend or family, causing them to feel lonely and now more likely to repeat the cycle themselves. The narcissist seeks victims to obtain narcissistic supply from. Pity, admiration, obedience. Their victims will internalize the narc's worldview of hierarchy and emotional blackmail as normal, acceptable, even necessary, and in turn seek to replicate it with their own victims. A traumatized person will freak out over small things. Crumbs on the counter, sounds in the distance, unexpected company, unexpected events, so much so that anyone who spends too much time around them will have to learn to freak out over the same trivial shit. At first, only to prevent a meltdown on the part of their traumatized peer, but after long enough, the habits will become so ingrained that they rule you even when you're by yourself. These kinds of contagion spread are much different from the passive nature of how flu or COVID spreads, where no direct action on the part of the infected is necessary. Someone with the flu will typically be aware they are sick and seek to minimize exposure to others, whereas those suffering from the kind of mental illnesses I've described will spread their infection wantonly. Do they know they are spreading the disease any more than a zombie knows it's replicating when it seeks to eat brains? Does it matter? Someone with the flu will retain their humanity. They are still themselves. The lonely